There is a parable in the Bible that most pastors rush through, not because it's confusing, not because it's hard to explain, but because it hits too close to home. It describes something that almost every single person sitting in a church pew, watching a sermon online, or reading their Bible alone at night is quietly doing, and nobody wants to say it out loud. Jesus told this story roughly 2,000 years ago, and the man at the center of it wasn't a villain. He wasn't a thief. He wasn't someone who woke up in the morning and said, "I am going to live a selfish, godless life today." He was just a man who worked hard, saved carefully, planned wisely, and God called him a fool. That word, fool, it lands like a slap. Because if you're honest, if you really sit with this story for more than 30 seconds, you start to realize something uncomfortable. You start to realize that this man could be you. This man could be me. This man could be the most responsible, most hardworking, most financially sensible person you know. And still, God looked at everything he built and called it foolishness. Now, before we go any further, I want to ask you something. And I want you to actually think about it, not just read past it. When was the last time you made a plan, a real plan, a 5-year plan, a savings plan, a retirement plan, a career plan, and somewhere in that plan, God was more than just a footnote? When was the last time a plan you made had God at the center of it, not just tagged on at the end like a signature you add out of habit? Most of us, if we're really honest, make our plans first. We figure out what we want. We figure out how to get it. We figure out how to protect it once we have it. And then, somewhere near the end of that process, we say a prayer. We ask God to bless what we've already decided. We bring him in as a consultant after the business decisions have already been made. And that is exactly what the rich man in this parable did. That is precisely the pattern Jesus was exposing. Not greed in the Hollywood sense, not a man twirling his mustache and laughing at the poor. Just a man doing what felt reasonable, what felt responsible, what felt smart. A man whose only mistake on the surface was being too successful. But Jesus called him a fool. And by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly why, and more importantly, you're going to see something inside this passage that almost nobody talks about. A treasure that is hiding in plain sight, buried right inside the most uncomfortable verse in this entire story. So stay with me, because this isn't just a lesson about money. This is a lesson about identity, about who you think you are, about what you think belongs to you, and about the terrifying, liberating truth that none of it, not one single thing you have built or saved or accumulated, was ever really yours to begin with. To understand this parable properly, we need to understand when Jesus told it, because context changes everything in the Bible. A verse pulled out of its setting can mean one thing. A verse understood in its full context can completely rewrite what you thought you knew. Luke chapter 12 opens in chaos. The text says that so many thousands of people had gathered around Jesus that they were literally trampling each other. Think about that for a moment. Not dozens, not hundreds. Thousands of people pressed so tightly together that people were getting crushed. This is not a quiet Sunday morning Bible study. This is a massive crowd, electric with energy, everyone wanting to get close, everyone wanting to hear what he would say next. Jesus had just finished a long, intense teaching session. He had warned his disciples about hypocrisy, about the danger of performing your faith for other people while your heart is somewhere completely different. He had talked about fear, about the courage it takes to live for God when everything around you is pushing you in the opposite direction. He had talked about the Holy Spirit, about confession, about the cost of following him genuinely, not just in words but in the actual decisions of your daily life. It was a heavy, serious, spiritually charged moment. And then right in the middle of all of that, a man in the crowd shouts out. And what he shouts is so startlingly ordinary, so completely human, that it almost feels out of place. He shouts, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Just think about that for a second. Jesus is teaching about eternal things, about the kingdom of heaven, about what it means to truly live, and someone raises their hand and says, Essentially, hey, can you settle a family money dispute for me? Now I want you to notice something important here. Jesus doesn't mock this man. He doesn't shame him. He doesn't say, how dare you interrupt me with something so petty? He takes the question seriously. He recognizes that underneath this very ordinary, very human request, there is something much deeper going on. There is a heart issue. There is a perspective problem. There is something this man, and by extension, the entire crowd, and by extension, you and me, desperately needs to understand. So Jesus responds, and his response has two parts. The first part is a question. He says, "Man, who appointed me a judge or an arbiter between you?" In other words, he's saying, I didn't come here to be a legal mediator. That's not my purpose. That's not what I'm for. And in saying that, he's also gently pointing out that this man has misunderstood what Jesus came to do. He came to address something far more fundamental than who gets what share of the estate. The second part of Jesus' response is a warning. Two words that are simple but carry enormous weight. He says, watch out. And then he adds, be on your guard against all kinds of greed, not some kinds of greed, not the obvious, embarrassing kinds of greed, all kinds, every variety, every subtle, respectable, well-dressed, thoroughly justified version of greed that exists. Watch out for all of it. And then he tells the story. Luke 12, verses 16 through 21. Let's read it together slowly, not racing through it like we have somewhere else to be, not skimming it because we think we already know it. Slowly, like it's the first time. The ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. Stop there. Before the man does anything, before he thinks anything, before he makes any plans at all, the ground yielded, the harvest came. Something happened to him that he did not manufacture. Something came to him from outside of himself. The land produced, the rain fell, the seasons turned, the crops grew, and all of that, every single part of that process was outside of his control. This detail matters enormously, and almost everyone skips past it. We want to get to the bigger Barnes part. We want to get to the punchline where God calls him a fool. But right here, in the very first sentence of the parable, Jesus is laying the foundation for everything that follows. The man received something. He was given something. He was the beneficiary of a process that he participated in, yes, but that he absolutely did not create. Continue reading. He thought to himself, what shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. Look at the internal conversation happening here. He thought to himself. This is a man alone with his own mind, working through a problem that he frames entirely as his problem, his crops, his dilemma, his challenge to solve. He doesn't pause and ask God what he should do. He doesn't turn to his community and say, we've been blessed with more than we need, what should we do with this? He thinks to himself, in isolation, about his situation, about his resources, about what he should do with what he now considers his. Continue. Then he said, this is what I'll do. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store my surplus grain. He makes a decision. It's a logical decision. It's a practical decision. If you were advising a farmer today, and that farmer came to you and said, I have more grain than my storage can hold, you would almost certainly say the same thing. Build more storage. That's just common sense. There is nothing on the surface of this decision that looks wrong. There is nothing obviously sinful about building a bigger barn. And this is where the parable gets dangerous, because it's exposing something that doesn't look like sin at all. It looks like good planning. It looks like responsibility. It looks like exactly what a wise, mature, sensible person would do. Continue. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry. Now we arrive at the heart of the problem. I'll say to myself. Again, the internal monologue. Again, the conversation that involves only one participant. And what is he planning to say to himself? Essentially, you're done, you've made it, you've secured your future, you can relax now. The striving is over, the uncertainty is gone. You have built yourself a wall of security so thick that nothing can reach you. Take life easy, you've earned it. Now watch what happens next. But God said to him, "You fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself?" The conversation that was happening only inside the man's head suddenly has a second voice, and that voice is God. And what God says is not gentle, not soft, not encouraging. It is a verdict. It is a two-word diagnosis of everything the man has just done. "You fool." And then the parable ends. Verse 21, "This is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves but is not rich toward God." That's it. No resolution. No second chance. No, but then the man repented. The story just ends with a principle, a warning, a mirror held up to anyone who was listening. What does fool actually mean? The word fool in the original Greek text of Luke is aphron. And this is a word that deserves more attention than it usually gets. In modern English, when we call someone a fool, we usually mean they're stupid or reckless or making an obviously bad decision. But in the biblical tradition, especially in the wisdom literature, Proverbs, Psalms, Ecclesiastes, foolishness has a very specific meaning that has nothing to do with intelligence. You can be brilliant and still be a fool in the biblical sense. You can have a PhD and still be a fool in the biblical sense. You can be the most successful, most admired, most capable person in every room you walk into and still be a fool in the biblical sense. In the biblical tradition, a fool is someone who lives as though God does not exist, not necessarily someone who denies God intellectually, not necessarily someone who gets up in the morning and consciously rejects their faith. A fool in the biblical sense is someone who makes their plans, runs their life, manages their resources, and constructs their future as though God is not a factor, as though God is not involved, as though the question of what God wants is simply not relevant to the decisions being made. The rich man in this parable was not an atheist. He was not a pagan. He was a Jewish man living in a society deeply shaped by the Torah, deeply shaped by the belief that God was the creator and owner of everything. He almost certainly believed in God. He almost certainly prayed. He almost certainly kept some version of religious observance. But when the moment of abundance arrived, when the blessing came, he functioned as though God had nothing to do with it and nothing to say about it. He built his plans in isolation. He made his decisions in isolation. He conducted his entire internal conversation about what to do with this incredible surplus, without once asking the one who caused the ground to yield in the first place. That is the foolishness. That is the diagnosis. Not that he built barns, not that he saved, not that he planned for the future, but that in all of his building and saving and planning, God was simply not present, not consulted, not considered, not thanked, not asked. And then God speaks. And what God says is devastating precisely because it cuts right through every layer of security the man had constructed. "You fool. This very night your life will be demanded from you." The Greek word used for life here is psyche. And psyche doesn't just mean soul in the way we sometimes think about it, as some separate spiritual entity that floats inside your body. Psyche means your whole self, your consciousness, your breath, your personhood, your entire existence as a living, thinking, feeling, experiencing human being. It means everything that makes you you. And God says, this very night all of that, all of you is being required back. Not borrowed, not paused, required, returned. As if God is saying, I lent you this life, I lent you this time, I lent you this body, these abilities, these opportunities, this season of abundance, and I'm calling it back tonight. Then the question that hangs in the air like smoke, then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? He spent years building. He demolished old barns and constructed new ones. He delayed enjoyment, delayed rest, delayed ease, all in service of a future that he was going to enjoy by himself, for himself. And now that future will belong to someone else. He won't even be there to see what becomes of it. The treasure nobody talks about. Now we get to the part I promised you at the beginning. The treasure inside this passage that almost nobody talks about. Everyone who teaches this parable focuses on the dangers of materialism, on the foolishness of ignoring God, on the uncertainty of life and the importance of humility. All of that is true. All of that is important. But there is something else hiding inside this story. Something that becomes visible only when you slow down and really look at the structure of what is happening. Look again at verse 19. The man says to himself, "You have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry." Notice who he is talking to. He is talking to himself. He says to myself. He addresses his own soul, "You have plenty." This man, at the moment of his greatest success, the moment when everything he had worked for had finally come together, the moment when the future looked brighter and more secure than it ever had, in that moment, the only voice in the room was his own. He wasn't talking to his wife. He wasn't talking to his children. He wasn't talking to his community. He wasn't talking to his neighbors. He wasn't talking to anyone in need who might have benefited from that surplus. He was talking to himself, about what he had built for himself. And that, I want to suggest, is the deepest tragedy of this parable, not just that he ignored God, but that in ignoring God he also ended up completely alone. His wealth had not connected him to anyone. It had insulated him from everyone. He had built not just a barn, he had built a wall. And that wall kept out the cold and the rain and the uncertainty, but it also kept out other people. It kept out community. It kept out generosity. It kept out the kind of richness that actually means something, the kind that Jesus will later describe as being rich toward God. And what does it mean to be rich toward God? Jesus doesn't define it explicitly in this passage, but the rest of the Gospels make it abundantly clear. To be rich toward God is to invest what you have, your time, your resources, your abilities, your surplus, into other people, into the kingdom, into the kinds of things that outlast your physical body and survive the night that God calls your life back. The treasure inside this parable is the positive image of what the rich man was not, because for every description of what the fool did, there is an implied description of what the wise person does. The fool received a blessing and assumed it was entirely his. The wise person receives a blessing and recognizes it as a stewardship, a trust, something to be managed on behalf of someone else, namely, God and others. The fool made plans in isolation, consulting only himself. The wise person brings God into the planning process from the very beginning, not as an afterthought, not as a rubber stamp on decisions already made, but as the first voice in the conversation. The fool stored everything for a future that only he would enjoy. The wise person looks at their surplus and asks, "Who else needs this? Who was this abundance sent to bless? What is God's plan for this harvest, not just my plan?" The fool built bigger barns. The wise person might also build, might also save, might also plan, but with open hands, not closed fists. With a posture of generosity woven into the very structure of the planning, not bolted on at the end. And the fool ended up alone, talking to himself, with everything he had ever accumulated surrounding him, and nothing that actually mattered when God's voice finally entered the conversation. The treasure in this parable is the picture of a life that is rich toward God. And that picture is formed by looking at this man and asking, what would the opposite look like? What would a life of genuine richness look like? Richness that survives the night when everything is required back. The Greek word that changes everything. I want to spend a few minutes on a specific Greek word that appears in this parable, because understanding it changes the way you read the entire story. When the man says, "Take life easy," the original Greek word there is anapol. And this word carries a meaning that is both beautiful and heartbreaking in this context. Anapol means to rest, to cease from labor, to find a place of refreshment and renewal. It's a word that appears in other parts of the New Testament in deeply positive contexts. In Matthew 11, Jesus uses a related word when he says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." The word for rest there is related to the same root, so rest itself is not the problem. Rest is something God designed. Rest is something Jesus offers. The problem is where the man planned to find his rest. He planned to find it in his barns. He planned to find it in the accumulated weight of his stored grain. He planned to rest in his own provision, in his own achievement, in the fortress he had built around himself with his own hands. And here is the heartbreaking part. This man was tired. He had worked. He had labored. He had built and managed and worried and planned. And now he was looking at his full barns and thinking, finally I can rest. Finally I can breathe. That desire is not wrong. That hunger for rest is deeply human. It is placed in us by God. But Jesus is pointing out, gently and devastatingly, that this man went to the wrong source. He tried to manufacture his own rest through his own accumulation. And on the very night he declared himself finally at rest, God came and reminded him that the only true rest, the only security that doesn't expire, the only peace that can't be taken by circumstances or death or the passing of time, is the rest that comes from God alone. There is an invitation hidden inside this judgment. When God says, "You fool," he is not simply condemning this man. He is pointing out, with the urgency of that final night, that this man spent his whole life chasing something he could have had for free. Rest, true rest. The peace that comes not from full barns but from a full relationship with the one who fills the barns in the first place. And this is where this ancient story becomes a very present, very personal question. Where are you looking for your rest? What is the thing you are building, the threshold you are trying to reach, the number in your bank account or your retirement fund or your career trajectory that you have decided will finally let you breathe? And have you considered the possibility that that thing, however good, however reasonable, however responsible, might be functioning in your life exactly the way the barn functioned in this man's life? The story of the man who had everything and nothing. Let me tell you about a man I want you to imagine. Not the rich man in the parable, a different man, a modern man, a man you might recognize. He grew up in a family that didn't have much. He learned early that money was something you worried about, something that was always slightly out of reach, something that determined whether life felt safe or terrifying. He watched his parents stress. He watched the conversations that happened at the kitchen table at the end of the month, and he made a decision, somewhere deep inside himself, that he would never live like that. He would work hard. He would be disciplined. He would save. He would build. He would make sure that no one in his family ever had to have those kitchen table conversations. And he did it. He worked harder than almost anyone around him. He made sacrifices that other people weren't willing to make. He delayed gratification for years, decades. He said no to things he wanted so that he could say yes to a future that felt secure. And slowly, carefully, methodically, he built what he had always dreamed of: the house, the savings, the retirement account, the career he was proud of, the life that from the outside looked like success. And one day, he didn't know which day it was, but one day, he looked around and realized that he had everything he had always planned for. And he felt nothing, not happiness, not peace, not the relief he had expected, just emptiness, and a vague, uncomfortable sense that he had been having a very long conversation with himself about himself for himself, and that somewhere along the way, everyone else had either left or been pushed out. And that God, if God had ever been part of the plan at all, had become a very quiet, very distant voice that he hadn't really listened to in a very long time. That man is not fictional. That man is real. That man is, in some version, the story that is playing out quietly in the hearts of millions of people right now. People who are responsible. People who are hardworking. People who, if you ask them on a Sunday morning, would tell you with complete sincerity that they love God and are trying to live a good life. But who have, somewhere in the daily business of building and saving and planning, gradually shifted God from the center of the conversation to the margins of it. And Jesus is not telling this parable to condemn those people. He is telling it to warn them. He is telling it with urgency and love, and the kind of directness that only makes sense when someone actually cares whether you end up in the right place. He is saying, watch out, be on your guard. Not because building is wrong, not because saving is wrong, not because planning is wrong, but because any of those things can become a substitute for God. Any of those things can become the place you go for the security and the rest, and the peace that only God can actually give you. What rich toward God actually looks like Jesus ends the parable with a phrase, not rich toward God. And I think this phrase is one of the most interesting, most underexplored phrases in the entire Gospels. What does it actually mean to be rich toward God? Because it would be easy to hear that phrase and think, oh, this is about giving money to church. This is about tithing. This is about financial generosity toward religious institutions. And while generosity is certainly part of the picture, the phrase is much bigger than that. To be rich toward God begins with a recognition that everything you have, not some things, not most things, not the surplus that's left over after you've secured what you consider yours, but everything you have is a gift. It was given to you. It came from outside of you. The ground yielded. You didn't create the ground. You didn't create the rain. You didn't create the capacity of your own mind to think and plan and work. All of it was given. And from that recognition flows a completely different posture toward your life and your resources. Instead of asking, what should I do with my stuff? You begin asking, what does God want done with what He has entrusted to me? That shift in question is small, but the difference it makes in how you live is enormous. To be rich toward God means that your generosity is not an afterthought. It is not what happens with the leftover when all of your own needs and wants have been met. It is woven into the very fabric of how you manage what you have. It is planned for, budgeted for, made a priority, not because you have to, not because you're afraid of what happens if you don't, but because you have genuinely come to understand that you are not the owner of your own life. You are the steward of it, and stewards manage on behalf of someone else. To be rich toward God means that the people around you, your family, your neighbors, your community, the stranger who has a need you have the ability to meet, are not interruptions to your plan. They are the plan. They are what your abundance is for. The man in the parable received a harvest so great that his existing barns couldn't hold it, and his first thought was to build bigger barns. But what if his first thought had been, we have more than we need? Who around us is in need? What is this surplus for? To be rich toward God means that your internal monologue, the conversation you have with yourself about your life and your future and your resources, is not a monologue at all. It is a dialogue. It is a conversation that begins with God, not that ends with God as a blessing on what you've already decided, but a conversation that starts with God, that is shaped by God, that takes its direction from what God wants rather than from what you have calculated is the optimal strategy for your own security. And to be rich toward God means something that might be the hardest of all. It means holding your plans loosely. It means building and saving and working with open hands, knowing that the future is not yours to control, that the night when everything is required back could come at any time, and that the only thing that will have mattered when it does is not what you accumulated but what you gave, not what you stored but what you shared, not how big your barns were but how rich toward God your life was. 3 questions to take with you. We are near the end of this time together, and I want to leave you with 3 questions. Not bullet points, not a checklist, just 3 questions that I want you to sit with after this video ends today, tonight, this week. Questions that come directly out of this parable and that I believe, if you take them seriously, have the power to genuinely change how you live. The first question is this: whose voice is in your planning? When you sit down to think about your future, your finances, your career, your family, the next 5 years of your life, who is in the room? Is it just you, thinking to yourself about yourself, the way the rich man did? Or is God genuinely part of that conversation? Not as a rubber stamp at the end, not as a prayer you say over a decision already made, but as the first voice, as the one whose perspective shapes the whole conversation from the very beginning. And if you realize that God has not been in the room, The invitation of this parable is simply to open the door and let him in. Right now, today, with whatever decision or plan or question is already sitting on your table. The second question is, what is your barn? Every single one of us has something that functions in our lives the way the barn functioned in this man's life. Something we are building or accumulating or protecting because we have come to believe, consciously or not, that this thing is what our security depends on. It might actually be money and savings. It might be a career reputation. It might be a relationship. It might be a version of yourself that you are performing for other people. It might be your health, or your control over your circumstances, or a plan you have made that you are holding on to with white knuckles because the idea of it not working out is simply not something you are willing to consider. What is your barn? What is the thing you have built between yourself and uncertainty, and between yourself and God, that gives you the feeling of security that only He can actually provide? The third question is the most important one, and it is the question that God asked the rich man on the night everything was required back. Not as a punishment, not as a gotcha, but as a question worth asking before that night comes rather than on it. The question is this: if tonight were that night, if tonight were the night when everything was required back, when the psyche was demanded, when all of it was over, what would you have been rich toward? What would have been the shape of your life? Would the people around you say that you were rich toward God, rich toward them, rich in the ways that actually last, that actually matter, that actually count for something beyond the inventory of your own barns? You do not have to have everything figured out to answer these questions well. You do not have to suddenly become a different person. This parable is not a call to recklessness. It is not saying that planning is sin, or that saving is wrong, or that taking care of your family is foolish. It is saying something much more specific. It is saying that a life built entirely for yourself, managed entirely by yourself, planned entirely in conversation with yourself, is a kind of poverty that no amount of grain can cure. The treasure inside this passage is the invitation to live differently, to hold what you have with open hands, to bring God into the room before the decisions are made, to look at your surplus, whatever form it takes, and ask not how do I keep this safe, but what is this for? To be the kind of person who, when the night finally comes, is found to have been rich toward God. That is the life this parable is pointing toward, not a smaller life, not a less responsible life, a richer one, richer in the ways that survive, richer in the ways that matter, richer in the ways that Jesus himself defined as the only kind of wealth worth building. The Bible is deep, and now you've seen it. You've seen what was hiding inside a story that most people are afraid to look at too closely. And I genuinely hope, that what you found inside it is not just a warning but a door into a way of living that is more generous, more connected, more honest, and more full than anything you could ever store in a barn. So here is what I want you to do, not tomorrow, tonight. Before you sleep, sit with one of those three questions, just one, whose voice is in your planning. What is your barn? Or, if tonight were that night, what would you have been rich toward? You don't need to have the answer fully formed. You just need to start the conversation. And this time, start it with God in the room. The Bible is deep. It doesn't have to be complicated. And what was hiding inside this parable, this uncomfortable, avoided, too close to home parable, was never just a warning. It was a door. And it is still open. And before you go, if this video opened something in you, if it made you think differently, sit differently, or ask a question you haven't asked in a while, I want you to know that this is what we do here every single week. Every week we take one passage, one parable, one word, one story that most people rush past, and we slow down, we look closely, we ask what is actually hiding inside it. Because the Bible is deep, and it doesn't have to be complicated. So if that's the kind of thing you want more of, hit subscribe. The bell is right there. It costs you nothing. And every week something new will be waiting for you. This has been Deep Made Simple.